Welcome to the Widowed Parent Podcast with your host, Jenny Lisk.
Hey everyone, it's Jenny Lisk, and this is episode 54 of the Widowed Parent Podcast. So I had such a great discussion with Brennan Wood and Jana DeCristofaro of the Dougy Center for this episode. And it was especially fun because we did a podcast swap, the first time I've done this. So listeners can actually hear me talking with Jana on their podcast, which is called Grief Out Loud, on last week's show, and this week you can hear me interviewing Jana and Brennan on this podcast. And so the Dougy Center has programs for kids and families in Portland, Oregon. So if you're in that area, I would encourage you to check them out. If you're not, you also might know that the Dougy Center is actually a national leader in the childhood bereavement space. So they have lots of experience with this, lots of good information and tips for all of us, even if we're not local to them. And on top of that, it was so great to talk with Brennan about her own story and her own journey. She is now the executive director of the Dougy Center, but a very long time ago was a client there herself as a teenager after her mom died when she was 12. So it was a pleasure to talk with her about her journey and her reflections as well. I hope you enjoy my discussion with Brennan Wood and Jana DeCristofaro of the Dougy Center. My guests today are Brennan Wood and Jana DeCristofaro, who are joining us from the Dougy Center in Portland, Oregon. Jana and Brennan, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you so much for having us.
Thanks, Jenny. Really excited for our conversation today.
Yeah, me too. I've been really looking forward to talking with you guys for a bunch of reasons. One, of course, is that you guys are doing fantastic work, and I'm eager to share with my listeners everywhere, as well as my listeners who may be in Portland, what you guys are doing. Also, this is kind of fun. It's the first time, I think they call it a podcast swap, that Jana, as you know, we talked last week for your podcast, Grief Out Loud, and we'll talk more later in the show about what you guys are doing with that. But this is kind of fun to get to talk to you guys twice in a span of a few days here. And I don't know if I ever told you guys, I used to live in Portland.
Oh, wow.
For about 5 years. So every time I hear the Dougy Center, even though we haven't connected until recently, I think, oh, that's kind of like my hometown,
Yeah.
group there. And one more thing, you guys are actually the first grief center that I ever heard of. And it's because when my husband got sick, the school principal sent an email to the families with news, and he pasted in some information from your website, tips for, grieving children and talking to people and things like that. And I thought, oh, the Dougy Center, I wonder what that is. And so now, 4 or 5 years later, here we are. So anyway, welcome again. I'm glad you're here.
Well,
Thanks for having us.
Yeah. So why don't we jump right in? Brennan, let's start with you. And now, these days, you're the executive director of the Dougy Center. But I think your journey starts a long, long time ago when you were 12 and before that.
Yeah, it sure does.
Can you first tell us a little bit about your mom.
Absolutely. My mom, Doris, first of all, she was just such an awesome person and an awesome mom. And I feel so grateful that I had ultimately the 12 years that I had with her. I've often said I wouldn't trade those 12 years for 75 with anyone else. She was a kind of a magical mom. She made everything fun. I say that she taught me the art of making every day a celebration. She really had a lot of fun, and we had a lot of fun as a family. She was a young mom, and unfortunately, when she was 34, and so I was 10 years old, she was diagnosed with breast cancer and ultimately died about 18 months later. She was 36 when she died, and it was 3 days after my 12th birthday. And my dad was 38, and my family just really did not have the tools to navigate her illness or her death. So we were really kind of in the aftermath of that, really struggling. I have an older brother and an older sister and myself and my dad, and it was really hard. It was a really, really hard time.
Yeah, I can imagine. One of the things I think you've talked about is kind of feeling different from other kids after your mom died. Can you talk a little bit about what that was like and how you handled that?
Absolutely. I definitely felt different. I felt like I was the only kid in the world that this had happened to. I certainly didn't know anyone else who was a kid and had had a parent die. And if I did know anyone else, I didn't know that had happened to them. So, I think at school, I wanted to be as normal as possible and didn't want to be different than my peers. But, going through that experience, really there's this before and after, and it really changes everything. And I felt isolated and different than my peers. My friends did not know how to handle it. I had a lot of really loving, well-intentioned people around me who had no idea how to support me. And most of them wanted to take my pain away. They wanted to make it better. And that in and of itself can be really problematic for kids. And it certainly was for me.
So that's interesting. So they wanted to fix it, it sounds like.
Absolutely. They wanted to fix it. They wanted to cure it and make it better. They wanted it to be something that I just quickly moved on from. I heard things like, your mom wouldn't want you to be sad. You have to live on in her memory. She was such an amazing person. She would want you to live on in her legacy. And ultimately, that just puts a lot of pressure on kids. It put a lot of pressure on me. And instead of just allowing me to experience a natural, normal, healthy process that is grief, it didn't support me the way that I needed to be supported. So I was really struggling.
Well, thank you for articulating that, because I think those are all things that you very commonly hear people say, people who probably mean very well. They're trying to help the child, and just maybe don't know that might not be the most effective way to interact with them.
Absolutely. I think that everyone around me wanted to help me. They wanted to make it easier and to make it better for me. And there were very few people that had the skills to do that. I remember one of my teachers wrote me a lovely card that I still have that was the only real acknowledgement that this was just a sad, lifelong process. And she talked about her own mother's death and talked about some memories that she had of my mom, and really just let it be what it was, as opposed to trying to fix it or make it something different.
Yeah, gotcha. Okay. And then I think at some point you actually found your way to the Dougy Center.
I did, yeah. So we were just struggling as a family, and my dad was 38, and he and my mom had been together since early high school, and he just didn't know how to help me. And I remember having a conversation with him in our kitchen and saying, this isn't working and I'm not okay. And he kept saying, you're fine, you're going to be fine. And I remember saying, what if I'm not? What are you going to do? And he said, I heard about this place called the Dougy Center. I really don't know what they do, but do you want to go?
And you were yes. How old at this point?
I was probably almost 13 would be my guess. It probably was somewhere around 6 to 9 months after my mom's death. I don't remember exactly.
Sure. But you weren't 17 or something. I mean, it was within that first year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was within the first year of my mom's death. And I feel so fortunate that we landed at the Dougy Center, and which quickly kind of turned into the place that I felt understood and heard, and getting to be with other kids who'd had a similar experience was absolutely life-changing for me. And then taking it a step further, being with adults who actually understood what I was going through and validated my experience. And instead of kind of pressuring me to feel better, just allowed me to be sad and to miss my mother and to grieve her death and to talk about her. It was it was amazing. It was exactly what I needed. It was the single best thing that could have happened to me after my mom's death.
Terrific. Well, and in fact, I think I've heard you say that the Dougy Center saved your life.
Absolutely. I actually say that often. And, who knows if I would still be alive, but I guarantee you that it would look entirely different if I hadn't had the opportunity to come through the program. I think, things that I pushed the envelope on anyway after my mom's death would have looked even more more potentially harmful for me. And I think that really getting that opportunity to just go through this natural, normal process, which is grief, in a place where I was supported and got some direction and permission to really feel the feelings was critical. I think one of the things that we often do when we are when we have these expectations that kids are just going to get over it or get through it, is that we don't teach kids how to really process tough, hard things. And that's part of the human experience, is that we go through difficult things in this world, and really learning how to navigate those things and knowing that you can go through hard things. And, we talk a lot about post-traumatic stress as a society, and we don't talk enough about post-traumatic growth, and that difficult things can lead to a deeper knowledge of yourself and the beauty of life, and all of these things that can be gifts that happen because of difficult things. And if you don't give kids the opportunity to really experience those things in a safe way and learn how to express emotion in a positive and forward-moving way, then I think you're really doing a disservice to kids.
Terrific. So I think another part of your journey that I've heard you talk about, when you were 19, I think you had a chance to meet Hope Edelman. First of all, can you tell listeners who she is, and then tell us about, tell us about that story?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I actually had the opportunity through the Dougy Center to meet a lot of people who are really well known in the field of childhood bereavement, as well as just this whole area of grief and loss. And Hope Edelman wrote a book called Motherless Daughters, and many of your listeners might be familiar with it because it was a really impactful book and has been published numerous times and translated into lots of languages. And I did meet Hope when I was 19. We were on the Lisa Gibbons talk show. I was kind of the token grieving motherless daughter teen, and she was there. It was on her first book tour, and she was incredibly impactful for me. And there have been many people who have just kind of paved the way for what has become my life's work. Hope is definitely one of those people. Donna Sherman, who was the executive director of the Dougy Center for 25 years before I became the executive director, is definitely one of those people that I look to as a mentor and a friend, and have looked to her for a long time for her impact on the field of childhood bereavement. Alan Wolfelt is another. So I was lucky in my young life through my work at the Dougy Center and volunteering at the Dougy Center to really get the opportunity to meet some folks who've really changed the world for grieving kids and grieving people.
Terrific. Well, and I'll put a link in the show notes. On one of the episodes of Grief Out Loud, Jana interviewed you and Hope Edelman together.
Yes.
I think it was a terrific discussion. So I'll put a link there for listeners. I think that'd be fun for to check that out.
Yeah.
So another thing, you've talked about how your mom's death is kind of part of your identity. Can you talk a little bit about that, and especially how has that changed over time?
Yeah, absolutely. My experience of having my mom die when I was 12 years old really, it changed everything for me. I often, and I know other folks who've had significant deaths in their life really talk about kind of there is this before and after, and who I was before my mom died and who I was immediately following my mom's death are two very, very different people. And I think when you're 12 years old and you learn more about the fragility of life than perhaps 12-year-olds should. I think you come away from that with, you come away with from that changed. And those changes some of them are very, very positive, and some of them probably not so positive. But who I am is entirely shaped by my mom's death. And I think that over time has definitely changed. What I would say is that it has also softened for me. And I think when my mom died and it was so painful and so raw, and I felt so isolated and alone, it felt at times like this shield or this kind of badge that I had to more prominently display in order for anyone to understand me. And I think over time, it has become something that is so ingrained in who I am and so much a part of who I am that it's no longer something that has to be this number one defining character, and it doesn't have to be front and center necessarily in all that I do, like it did when I was younger. I think grief can be so isolating, and I also think it can be something that in your isolation you can feel like if you're the only person in the world that this has happened to, then no one can possibly understand the depths of what you've gone through. And in community, when you find community with other grieving people, I think that over time that softens when you learn that although your own experience of grief might be very unique to who you are and your relationship with that person, there also is a commonality amongst those of us who are grieving, and there is kind of this community and camaraderie where we can really share this experience in order to support one another.
Mm-hmm. Terrific. Well, so speaking of sharing experiences and community and things like that, let's switch gears a little bit and talk about the Dougy Center.
Absolutely.
I think is it one of the oldest or the oldest program of its type in this country?
Yeah, it is. As far as we know, it's the oldest. It was started in 1982.
Wow.
And
82, 92, 2002, 2012. Was that like 38 years?
Yeah, we're in our 38th year of being in existence and serving kids and families. And we're up to, at this point, almost 50,000 kids and families have been served at the Dougy Center.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, it's really remarkable. And so the Dougy Center began in memory of a little boy named Dougy who died of an inoperable brain tumor. And a nurse in the Portland area named Bev Chappell was doing some work with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And you may be familiar with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's work. She really kind of was a pioneer who brought the hospice movement to America. And Dougy had written her a letter asking some questions as a child who was dying. And they started this friendship. And so when Dougy was coming to Portland, Elizabeth knew Bev through some of their end-of-life work together and workshops and such. And so Bev was connected to Dougy. And what Bev really learned from Dougy as she watched him talk to other kids in the hospital and really navigate his own illness and ultimately his death in a way that made other people around him uncomfortable because he really wanted to talk about it. What she learned from Dougy was that kids help other kids, that they speak the same language. And she started the Dougy Center in the family room of her home, and it started off with two little boys who each had a dad die. And what she saw was that those boys came together and that the mothers came together and they really found support with one another. So she continued to provide support for folks, and it quickly outgrew her living room. And we have grown and grown to now serving over 550 grieving kids a month and over 425 of their adult family members.
Wow.
So we provide support services to the children after the death of a family member or for a teen, a close friend, all the way into young adults. And then we provide support to the family member who brings them as well. So the surviving parent or or parents or caregiver, whoever's taking care of those kids, we provide support to the entire family.
Mm-hmm. That's just incredible to grow from 2 boys and 2 moms in a living room to 50,000 people served over 38 years. That's amazing.
It is amazing. And as word about the Dougy Center got out, then we started doing trainings and really kind of people looked to us as a leader to show them how they could serve grieving kids and families in their communities. And so now there's this national alliance of grieving children that we helped to start. And you may be familiar with the NAGC. And there's our estimation is over 500 programs across the country and around the world that are doing similar work to the Dougy Center. And really the Dougy Center was the first. So
that's awesome. That's great. Well, and I'm very familiar with the NAGC. I actually interviewed Vicky J back in November as part of Children's Grief Awareness Month. So that was terrific.
Wonderful. I just joined the board at the National Alliance for Grieving Children.
I saw that. Congratulations.
Yeah,
yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's amazing. I'm a member, so I think I submitted my ballot and voted for you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for your vote.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so, okay, this reminds me, because I keep hearing in the grief kind of world and these conferences and whatever, the Dougy Center model, and I'm doing air quotes here. So what does that mean? What is the Dougy Center model?
Yeah. So we really have a model based on peer support. So our groups are essentially meant to bring together kids who are around the same age, who've had a very similar experience in their family. So our groups are divided typically always by age, and then we try to group like experiences together. And the model is a peer support model where kids come for a support group to be with other kids. And each group has about 15 or 16 kids. They're ongoing groups, so there's no beginning and no end. Kids can be in our program as long as they need to be here. And the model itself is really the way that we run those peer support groups in a very specific way that's structured with a lot of flexibility for kids to express themselves in whatever way works for them. So there's opportunities to share their story about their family, and there's opportunities to do some activities around that. But then there's also a lot of opportunity for a really child-led experience where they can go into different areas of our home and express themselves through art and music, through big play, big energy. We have a dress-up area, theater room. We have a play hospital room where kids can really play through the things they've seen in a hospital environment that they are grappling with. So we really provide an opportunity for kids to express themselves in ways that work for the kids. And the model, the way that we run our support groups, the way that we engage with families is a unique experience for families. And that's really when people talk about the air quote Dougy Center model, that's really what they're talking about, is the way that we run our peer support groups for grieving kids.
Gotcha. Okay. So if a parent is, well, maybe they're in Portland, maybe they're somewhere else with another grief center near them, and thinking about, gosh, maybe my kid needs something like that. Maybe they don't. I don't know. I guess, what would you suggest that they be thinking about, or what kinds of questions should they be asking themselves or others to kind of think about whether they should try to engage their kid in a program like that?
Yeah. Well, I'm actually going to defer to my lovely colleague, Jana, because Jana she's been at the Dougy Center for, well, over, 17, 18 years now, Jana, and working directly with kids and families. And she really would be the right person to ask that, since I am more of an administrator and less of a clinician. I would want to defer to her on that.
Okay. Sounds good. And Janet, that sounds like you've been there like half of the Dougy Center's existence.
I feel like I've been here half of my existence. It's a great question. Families call us all the time to say, I don't know if my kid needs this. I don't know if I need this. And what I love about our setup in particular is when families first contact us, if they're at all interested in the program, they're invited to participate in our orientation. And that is a one-time group appointment. Very low pressure. It's a chance for them to come and be with other kids who are grieving, who are all coming to the Dougy Center for the first time. They take a tour of the program, so they get to see all those rooms that Brennan just talked about, and they really get to just feel it out. Like, what are the staff like? What are the other kids and teens? How are they interacting with one another? And for many of them, they come in feeling like, I don't need to go to this place. I don't want to be with a bunch of sad people. They're going to make me cry. And slowly over that hour-long orientation, they start to realize like, oh, this is a place for me to do and say what I feel like I want to do and say. And there's no expectation. I always joke with kids at orientation that they don't get extra credit if they cry. If they cry, that's totally fine too. But there's not an expectation that because it's a grief support group, it's the sad house. So I think for a lot of kids, the idea that they could come and be with other kids who are going through something similar, and maybe they talk directly about their grief and their people, and maybe they go and play foosball together. And when they look up from scoring a goal in foosball, they get to see all these other kids have had somebody die too, and I don't have to explain myself. So those are just some background things for families if they're trying to figure out, is this a place for us to go? And, there's lots of reasons why kids might choose to come to the Dougy Center. They might come because they're the only person in their peer group, the only person in their school group who's had a parent or a sibling die, and they feel really alone in that. Or maybe they do have other friends who have had someone die, but those friends aren't in a place where they can really show up and support them in the way that feels helpful. Or it feels easier for them to come and be with kids who aren't part of their day-to-day life and share a little bit more openly and vulnerably, knowing that when they leave at the end of the evening, at the end of their group, they're not going to have to interface with these folks in math class the next day.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I was going
to say, one of the things that's really helpful for families to know is that because we're peer support and we're not providing therapy or counseling, there can be that question of like, well, does my kid need therapy or do they need peer support? And
yeah, that's a good question.
Our groups are a really great complement to kids who are also pursuing therapy and counseling. And so to recognize that the things that we're going to provide are community to help decrease that sense of isolation, to help kids give a chance to ask questions of one another, to share memories, to honor their person, to find new ways to cope with their grief. But we aren't directly addressing things like anxiety, depression, challenges at school. And so if your kiddo's in a place where their grief is really starting to affect their day-to-day functioning, it can be super helpful to do like both of those things at the same time. And then over the course of that, you might choose to just do therapy or just switch to peer support, but that they line up really well with one another.
Okay, well, that's helpful because I think one of the things that I hear a lot or even struggle with is if you get to that point where you say, okay, my kid does need help. But then it's like, well, what kind of help do they need? Where do I find it? What type of program? The therapy versus the peer grief group? Like how does this whole picture fit together? So thank you for going through that. I do think that's helpful. Along those lines, I mean, I suppose you might tell me that the answer varies, but is this something like somebody puts on their list, the day after the funeral, you call the Dougy Center? Or is it like, 30 days out or a year out? Or like, do you find that there's a timeline when it is most effective or when it's not all that productive to engage with a group like you guys?
It's such a great question, and I'm definitely going to give the annoying "it depends" answer because it really truly does
I had
depend.
a feeling you would, but there must be some considerations to think about.
I mean, I think there's families who call us the day that the person dies And that person has been dealing and living with an illness for months or years. And the family's been receiving support through hospice or maybe even through a group for other families who have somebody who's living with an advanced serious illness. And so for them to move from that type of support into a bereavement support group feels really like they're ready. It's the right time. Other families, though, maybe because they have been in the process of supporting someone who's living with an advanced serious illness and have been receiving support, when that person dies, they actually want to take a break. Like they just need some time to integrate on their own, and then they might reach back out for some peer support. And then, a family who somebody dies really suddenly, unexpectedly in a car crash, or they die of substance use, or they die of suicide. Some of those families call us the exact same day, and some families might call us a month, 2 months, 3 months, 4 months out. It's really going to depend on the individual situation. If families are calling us right away or reaching out for support right away, some things to let their kids know is that, this is going to be an opportunity to come sit in a room with other kids who have all had somebody die. And for some of us, that might feel really good. Like, oh, I'm not alone. I don't really know what to say. I don't know what I think. I don't know what I feel, but I can hear other people start to articulate what I might be walking into over the next weeks and months. And for some kids, it's like way too much. Like I can barely wrap my head around what's happened to me. I cannot listen to everybody else's story. So again, it could even be different within the same family. You might have one kiddo who's like, yes. And one kiddo is like, oh my gosh, absolutely not. This is not what I need right now. But maybe 6 months from now, a year from now, they look up and they're like, okay, I'm finally ready to interact with other people's stories of grief.
Yeah. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you for talking through that. And I think you're absolutely right about that idea that if you have more than one kid, you most likely have more than one, I don't know, style of grief or experience of grief or situation or particular set of challenges or whatever. It's not like every kid is going to be in the same boat here, even though they all had the same loss of the same person. Okay. So next I was going to ask you about resources that you guys have that are not necessarily for people local to you. We've spent some good time talking about, if somebody is in or near Portland, to learn about what you guys offer. One of the most obvious resources you guys have that is not location dependent is, of course, your podcast. And Jana, I know you're the host and I believe the founder of the podcast. Can you tell us a little bit about, how long has it been going?
So we started Grief Out Loud in January of 2015. So this day that we're talking actually, marks the 5-year anniversary of the podcast.
Wow, terrific.
Yeah, it's been a wild ride, as I imagine you can relate to, as also being a host, producer, editor, everything for the podcast.
Yeah.
And when we started the podcast, because it really did line up with our other resources that we try to provide for kids and teens and families who are anywhere in the world. So we know we have these, grief support groups here in Portland. We have our Pathways program for families who are facing an advanced serious illness. And then we have other peer support programs that we've helped to train and consult with over the years around the country and around the world. And even with that, we know there's so many people who aren't able to access those services for a variety of reasons. One of might be distance, location, could be economic resources, but then also age-wise. So we have a lot of people who come to volunteer at the Dougy Center. We have over 200 volunteer facilitators, and so many of them are people who were children when somebody in their life died, and they didn't have a chance to go to a place like the Dougy Center. So they come back as volunteers and say, oh, my life would have been so different if I could have had this support then. And that really got me thinking, how many people are out there in the world who are in a similar position? Maybe they're in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 80s now, and they were a child when someone died, and they didn't have a chance to access this support. Could they too, queue up a podcast episode, listen to a conversation with somebody who has an experience of grief, and could they find that sense of connection, that sense of validation, that normalization of their experience that they didn't get to have when they were a kid? Could that provide some support 20, 30, 40, 50 years later? So that was the original thought behind it. And I think we've definitely reached that quote unquote goal, and that we receive emails all the time from people who say, this is exactly the conversation I needed 20 years ago. Or somebody writes in and says, my partner just died last month and I have 2 kids, and it's been so helpful to hear from other grieving parents on your podcast, as I'm sure you get emails all the time from people who are so grateful just to have a resource that they can listen to. The other thing, I was just talking with another grief podcaster, Shelby Forsythia, in the last episode of Grief Out Loud. And she was saying that for her, when her mom first died, and I've heard this from many people, she couldn't read. Like, she just couldn't focus long enough to read an article or a book. And so to get a book that says, here's what grief's about, was like, oh gosh, I can't even get through the first paragraph. But for her, she was able to listen. And that was her way of being able to take in and synthesize information. So I appreciate it from that aspect too, that people need different ways of inputting support and information when they're in grief. And to know that for those who, they can queue up an episode and bike or drive on their commute and listen then, and they don't have to carve out specific time to try to learn something new in that way.
Terrific. Well, and that was an interesting episode, the one you just mentioned, that was, I believe, last week, as of the time we're recording this. I'll put a link to that one in the show notes too. I think for anybody who maybe has a young adult or college age, I believe she was about 21 when her mom died. I think for people who are in that age group with a college age kid, it might be, it gives some, perspective and some insights to hear her story too.
Yeah. And then some of our other resources that are available for folks who aren't right here in the Portland area, we have a pretty extensive series of tip sheets. I think those are some of the ones you referenced when the principal of your school first sent an email out after your husband's diagnosis. So we have tip sheets that are primarily geared for adults and caregivers. So it might be supporting teens when a close friend dies, or how do you talk to your preschooler about the fact that somebody has died. So there's a ton of tip sheets available on that perspective. There's some that are written specifically for teens and young adults available as well. And then we have a series of tip sheets that are written for our volunteer facilitators that are available to the public. So if you're looking to learn a little bit about our model, the skills that we use, how to really navigate those conversations with kids and teens, there's great tips in that series. And then we also have an online toolkit specifically for schools and community organizations, and has a lot of the same information as our main website, but in a little bit easier to navigate format for school teachers, counselors, and administrators.
Terrific. Okay, so I'll link that in the show notes for sure too, and encourage people to go and check that out and find the topics and tip sheets that are relevant to their particular situations. I'm thinking.
Can I chime in with one other thing?
Yes, please.
I also just want to mention that we do on our website have a place where you can look up programs similar to the Dougy Center in any community that we're aware of. And I believe the National Alliance for Grieving Children also has something similar on their website as well. So that if someone is listening to this podcast and wonders about services that are similar to the Dougy Center but aren't in Portland, Oregon, they can look either on the Dougy Center website or the National Alliance for Grieving Children website and see if there's something in their community where they could at least give them a call and talk to them about what they offer. And we do a lot of phone consultation at the Dougy Center, and always welcome folks to call us to ask specific questions about their family or how they can support their kids, as well as to help access a lot of our resources.
Okay, so even somebody who's not local to you and isn't going to be coming to use your programs for that reason could
Absolutely.
Call you.
Yeah,
and
they can look on our website or call us. Yeah.
Okay. Is there any kind of a charge for that?
No, in fact, the Dougy Center doesn't charge a fee for any of our services. So none of our programs are fee-based in any way. We rely on the generosity of folks in the community and world to support our program, and we don't get any government support or get any insurance reimbursement. So when a family comes to the Dougy Center, their entire experience is free of charge, including all of our resources. There is a charge for some of our books and DVDs and those types of things on our website if someone from out of the area is ordering them. But if it's cost prohibitive, they can certainly call us and see what we can send to them that would be perhaps in a different format, like a PDF or that kind of thing, but that would be free of charge. Our mission is very much to support grieving kids and families everywhere, and we want to get them the help and information that they need.
Yeah. Terrific. Okay, good. Thank you for mentioning that. Which reminds me, so is this the link to find programs in other communities? Is that a U.S. based statement for my international listeners? Do you have anything in Canada or the UK or?
I believe that we do have international listings as well on our website.
Okay.
Yes, I believe so. I think
that is true. If there's any program that we're aware of in any other country, they're listed on our national searchable directory.
Oh, good.
Thanks, Jana.
Okay. Good. All right. Thank you. Because I do have quite a few listeners in other places too. So I'm always trying to figure out, what resources might be available for them in their communities as well.
Absolutely.
Okay, good. So before we leave the topic of the podcast, Jana, are there a few, I don't know, if somebody wants to get started, listen to your podcast, are there a couple episodes you think maybe they should start with, or a couple of your favorite episodes that we could highlight and link to?
I love this question, and it's so hard to answer.
With 5 years worth, you must have hundreds of.
Yeah, I was just looking through some of them this morning, and we're up to episode 131, and they're all. Each episode is so precious to me because it's somebody's story and somebody who trusted me with their story and trusted our listening audience with their experiences. So I feel like they're all really fantastic in that way, specifically for folks who are, grieving the death of a parent or a co-parent and have kids that they're like, okay, how do I do this now? Yeah. I was really thinking about, we did a series on grief and parenting. And the first two episodes in that were with a mom who had two very young children and was pregnant when her husband died. And so she talks a lot about supporting infants and toddlers and kids who never even had a chance to meet their parent before that person died. So that's a really insightful episode. And then the episode right before that, which is episode 118, is also with a dad whose daughter was 5 when his wife and his daughter's mom died of suicide, and talks very eloquently about how he took care of himself, how he tried to show up for his daughter, how he enlisted the support of their community, and how grief has really changed for them over time because his daughter's now junior or senior in high school. So I appreciate that of him being able to kind of give that longitudinal perspective of how grief really evolved for them.
Yeah. Okay, good. I'll link to those for sure. And I don't think I've heard those two, so I'll go listen to those myself. Next time I go walking or something, I'll tee those up. Cool. Actually one more question on the podcast. I almost forgot. I've been wanting to ask you about this. In your opening remarks, maybe it's your voiceover intro or whatever, you say you promise to be platitude and cliche free. Why is that important, do you think?
Well, I think if I started introducing platitudes and cliches in the podcast episode, all of the kids and teens and young adults that I work with in the peer support groups would fire me because they come to the Dougy Center specifically for an experience that can be so hard to find outside of the walls of their peer support group, which is people being willing to listen to their story, to stay present in their discomfort, to withstand the intensity of their emotions. And, just as Brennan mentioned, how hard it is to find people outside of these specific intentional communities where people can do that. And kids and teens are so sensitive to the fact that they are making somebody else uncomfortable. And so it was really important to me in the podcast to be able to sit with that experience, sit with those emotions, sit with those wonderings and those questions without piping in to say oh, but at least you had this kind of experience with your parent, or isn't it so great that you learned that lesson from them? Or aren't you just so proud of yourself for who you are now that your person has died? Those are all things that I think the guests often offer. And that's fantastic that that's the meaning that they have around it. But I don't ever want to be in a place of deciding that for them or putting anything upon them. That's really about me and my opinion. And oftentimes what's underlying that is I'm feeling uncomfortable. So let me say this thing so that you will look as though you feel better so I can feel better. So that's to me really the foundation of wanting to stay out of those platitudes and those cliches, because people can find those anywhere, any day. And I felt like, that's been covered. I don't need to add to that canon.
Yeah. Such a good point. And something I think my listeners, I'm sure, are very well familiar with hearing those platitudes and cliches all the time as well.
Yeah, I think one of the things that is so important for people to remember and for us to offer folks is the idea that many things can be true at the same time. And as, humans and grievers, we may really want to and need to make meaning out of what we've experienced for ourselves, but that isn't anyone else's job. And you can hold two things that might be very opposing at the same time. I can be very grateful for the gifts that I have been given in my life because of my mother's death. I am a stronger person because of it. I have a deeper appreciation for life and the brevity of life. I have deeper friendships, I believe, because of my mother's death. But I'm never, ever going to be glad that my mom died. And I can hold I can hold gratitude for what the gifts I've been given and still never be glad or grateful that my mom died. And I think that can be really tough for a lot of folks in the world to kind of sit in that space where just because you have made personal meaning out of what you've experienced doesn't make it okay. And so I think that we kind of offer that space through the podcast and through our resources, as well as in our groups, where people can make whatever meaning is important to them to make out of their experience, while also holding the space that doesn't make what they've experienced okay. And that doesn't negate the pain or the hurt or the hard parts of grief.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that you articulated that, because I don't think that's something we've talked about a lot on this show yet, but it's something that I've definitely noticed, that two things can be true and they could seem maybe conflicting or seem maybe opposite or something. Like you just said, you can be grateful that you grew in these ways or developed these perspectives and still hate the fact that your mother died.
Yes. Yeah.
And you don't have to resolve those two somehow. They can both be true, and that's okay.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And I think as soon as for myself, when I realized that, it made a lot of things just a little bit easier. I think not feeling like I had to, because it's really kind of unresolvable anyway. Yeah. So you're kind of hitting your head against the wall if you think you're going to resolve it.
Yeah. And I think that kind of goes back to this idea that, that we're not trying to cure grief, right? We aren't trying to fix anything. We're not trying to take away that experience from people. What we're doing is trying to give them a safe environment in which to navigate those experiences, and that we can't fix it. We can't cure it. That's not what our job is, and that's not what, as humans, we need to do with grief. We need to experience it and walk through it and incorporate whatever pieces of it we need to into who we are and carry those forward. And that can be done in a positive, healthy way, given the right circumstances and the right support.
Yeah, terrific. Okay. We're running towards the end of our time here, but there's one question we haven't gotten to, which I really do want to ask you guys. So I'm just going to totally shift gears and ask you, because it doesn't have a smooth transition. So the question is, kind of that first 90 days, 30, 60, 90 days after loss, what do you think the parents should be, widowed parents, I'm talking about now the surviving parent, what do you think they should be thinking about or doing or aware of, or what should kind of be on their radar screen in that kind of immediate period after that other parent dies?
Jenny, you asked me this question last week when we were talking on Grief Out Loud, and I've been thinking about it ever since then. Because again, I think it's another one of those, it's really going to depend on a family circumstance in terms of what needs to be attended to logistically. I mean, there's going to be so many pieces of sort of the bureaucracy that comes with death that's going to be taking up a lot of time and space for widowed parents. And I guess if I would offer to widow parents is the urgency they feel to make sure they have everything in place that their kid is going to need. If they could try to dial that down a little bit for themselves, because it's so much pressure in the midst of having to figure out all the ways that life is just like shattered in a sense. And to realize that grief it's a lifetime experience, and that they don't have to get it all figured out in those first 90 days. And that there's going to be time for their kids to be processing this loss and processing their grief as they hit different developmental milestones, as different events in their life happen. So there's going to be a lot of time to, provide that support.
It's almost like it's a marathon.
Absolutely.
And not a sprint here.
Yeah. And so to try to take a little pressure off of themselves, when I think about what can they do to be most helpful to kids in the first, hour to first 90 days, is to try to do what they can to take care of themselves. So to make sure that they are accessing support in a way that allows them to have some emotional wherewithal to be with their kids, which is a really big, hard thing to do right after someone dies, and to focus on being honest with their kids, giving kids information that's helpful for them, whether that is how the person died, what's going to happen in their household in the next couple of days, whether that's we have a lot of family and friends who are coming. We're starting to talk about what we're going to do in terms of a memorial or a funeral. So keeping kids apprised of what's happening and inviting their participation, so that kids know that the invitation is there, but there's no pressure. So maybe when it comes to a lot of family and friends coming to stay with them, to say, we're a little tight on space and it can be really hard to have all these people in our house. Where do you want to be sleeping? So giving kids some choices around that. Or are there friends or family that that you could go to take a break from all these people in the house? Let's make a list of folks that we can reach out to who, if you need an afternoon away or you need an evening away, here's some place you can go. So that's getting really detailed, but I think it falls into that bigger picture of keeping kids informed, asking them for their input, and then trying to provide as much routine and consistency as possible in the middle of a time that is totally without routine and consistency. So again, can be a really tough thing. And this is particularly true for younger kids. It's not uncommon for really young kids to be like, okay, daddy died, daddy does snack, and daddy does bedtime. Who's doing snack and bedtime? Those are their two most important things right now. And that can be hard for the other parent to hear, there's so much more happening than snack and bedtime.
Yeah.
But for those kids, that's the immediacy of their world. And so just having a mindset of keeping track of what are the routines and the consistencies that we can create for kids, and choices and information.
Okay. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense.
I would just want to echo everything Jana said, and she's awesome and brilliant and eloquent. And I would also want to highlight one thing that she touched on, that I think telling the truth and being honest is so critical in the aftermath of these things, especially for families when it isn't, maybe the situation is more complicated. I think that telling kids the honest truth as you know it, and sometimes the truth is, I don't know, and that's okay. But I think really being present with them and modeling for them that you are going to tell them the truth can be critical for kids. So everything that Jana said, and just highlighting that piece around really being honest and telling them the truth is, I think, really, really important.
Yeah. Yeah. Good. Okay. Thank you. It's so important. So thank you for going through that. Okay. Why don't we wind up here with a question for each of you. And so, Jana, we'll start with you. If you could say one thing to widowed parents, what would it be?
Everything I just said, plus, I think I would just offer, you're not going to get an A+ in this. So, try to take, again, that pressure off of yourself, and that, doing the best you can in the moment with the resources you have access to, knowing that you're probably going to say something or do something that doesn't feel great for your kid. And that's okay, because when you're grieving, nothing feels good. And I think back to Megan Devine, who's a writer and a speaker about grief, and how she would say to her friends, you're going to totally get it wrong. If you come and say A to me today, I'm going to hate it. And if you come tomorrow and you say A, I might love it. And so knowing that, showing up, being honest, being truthful, trying to take good care of yourself, being transparent with your kids, there's going to be things that are just not going to work in the moment. And that's okay. You can go back to it. You can say, I was trying my best. I'm realizing after we talked, maybe that wasn't the best decision. How can we make it work better for you? And so anything you do to like take that pressure off yourself to try to get an A+ in grieving parenthood, that's what I would offer.
Yeah. Okay. I love that. And that, it almost sounds like then you're combining that too with the honesty element and the talking, that if you do something that maybe you found that you say something you regret or whatever, that you loop back with them and
absolutely.
talk it through. Yeah.
And that way you're modeling for them to say, I was really tired yesterday. I was missing your dad so much. I was just tapped out and I snapped at you and I'm really sorry. And even though I'm grieving and I'm tired, it's not okay to snap at you. And I apologize for that. That way you're modeling to them that if they do that to you, they might come back to you and say, sorry, Mom, I was really tired from school and a kid at school said something really mean to me. And so I snapped at you too. Mm-hmm. The one other thing I'd add to that to make this a paragraph answer is I think as a grieving parent, there's this dichotomy to hold that's really challenging, which is validating kids' experiences, validating their emotions, letting them know it's okay that they don't feel okay, and holding that bigger picture and bigger perspective of hope. Like, this totally sucks, and I know we're going to be okay. Not that you have to be okay, but I know as the adult in your life, we're going to do everything we can to still be a family and still be okay.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you. So Brennan, if you could say one thing to widowed parents, what would you say to them?
Well, I love everything that Jana just shared about that. I totally agree with her. And I think that last point of holding the bigger picture and kind of the hope and the knowledge that you are, as a family, going to be okay. I think one of the huge challenges for people is when you're in the midst of it to really know how it's, going to affect your family long term, and to be in this place of, I'm sure, a lot of fear and a lot of, deep grief. And what is this going to look like for us long term? And I think knowing that there folks like me who've come out on the other side of it, and 32 years later after my mother's death, that there are beautiful gifts that have come from not just my mother's life, but also her death. And I am a stronger person and have a deeper connection to my life in a lot of ways because of my mother's death. And, when you're in that just immediate aftermath, I think it's incredibly difficult to see any of that. And, I often felt right after my mother's death that I was essentially in an ocean that was in a storm, and I was being just pummeled wave after wave of grief, and I could barely get a breath. But what does happen over time is that lessens, and you're able to navigate the waves and have longer periods of rest. And ultimately, at a certain point, without even, I think, necessarily even knowing it, you're walking on the shore. And of course, those waves hit you once in a while, and it's not that it isn't ever present in your life, but you do get to this place where it has shifted and evolved. And I think, knowing that there are people who've come before you and who are kind of holding the light on the shore, and knowing that there are people who are in this with you, hopefully gives folks the sense that they can navigate this time, as difficult and awful as it is.
Mm-hmm. Okay, terrific. Well, thank you so much. I think that's a great place to end. So my guests today are Brennan Wood and Jana DeCristofaro from the Dougy Center in Portland, Oregon. So Brennan, where can listeners find the Dougy Center if they'd like to connect with you or learn more about your work?
Yeah, the easiest place is online through our website at dougy.org. That's DOUGY.org, or through any of our social media channels, as well as they can always call our office in Portland, Oregon.
Okay, terrific. And Jana, where can people find the podcast?
So our website is one place, which is the dougy.org. But also it's in, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, like all the places people go to find their podcasts. If you just look for Grief Out Loud, it will pop up.
Okay, fantastic. Well, Jana and Brennan, thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thanks, Jenny. And thanks for all the work that you're doing.
I hope you enjoyed my interview with Brennan Wood and Jana DeCristofaro as much as I did. You can find show notes and all the links at widowedparentpodcast.com. Look for episode 54. And also look for my discussion with Jana on last week's episode of the Dougy Center's podcast, Grief Out Loud. It's episode 133, and I'll put the link in the show notes, or you can find it on your favorite podcast app. So Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, so forth and so on. Speaking of Apple Podcasts, it would be so helpful in helping more widowed parents find the podcast if you might take just a moment and leave a review in Apple Podcasts. It's actually really easy to do. If you listen on your phone, you can go into the podcast app and there should be a button you can click to leave a review, and you just click on the stars, and then you can type a brief comment. Just anything about the podcast would be super helpful, and I would really appreciate anything you guys can help me do to help the podcast have more reach out to more widowed parents and have more people be able to listen to these episodes and discussions and learn from the terrific guests on the show. So, as always, thank you so much for listening. Lots of great content coming up in the next few weeks. So, I will see you soon. Okay, thanks for listening. Until next week, keep smiling.
Thank you for listening to the Widowed Parent Podcast with your host, Jenny Lisk. Connect with us on social media and at widowedparentpodcast.com.